At my sister's wedding, I never expected the worst humiliation of my life. But it came like a slap across the face when she stood up in her shining white dress and turned her speech into a cruel performance, mocking me in front of everyone, calling me a single mother unwanted by anyone. And the room erupted in laughter, as though my pain was the punchline of a joke. And the woman who should have defended me, my own mother, leaned in with a cold smirk and added that I was nothing but a used product. And in that moment, the floor could have swallowed me whole, and I would have been grateful, because there is nothing more painful than being torn down by your own blood on a day that was supposed to be filled with joy and celebration. Before I go further, let me pause for just 1 second and tell you this. When you like this story or leave a comment, it means more than you can imagine, because every click of support helps me bring more of these real, raw moments to light. And your voice matters. Your presence matters. And I am grateful for every single person who listens and walks through this journey with me. My name is Jessica. I am 29 years old, and I have lived most of my life in the shadow of my younger sister, who was always the golden child, the one who never heard the word no, while I was left to carry responsibilities, mistakes, and burdens all on my own. And now, sitting at her wedding, dressed in a simple gown that could never compete with the glitter of her designer choices, I felt the weight of every comparison pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. The laughter echoed in my ears long after it died down, ringing with the sound of judgment and superiority. And even as the music started again and people clapped for the bride and groom, I could not escape the heat in my face and the sting in my heart, because it was not just a joke, it was a message. A public declaration that I was less, that I was undeserving, that my life was a story of failure, written in bold letters for everyone to see. And I sat there frozen, humiliated, praying the night would end before the next dagger was thrown at me. Growing up, I was always the shadow to my sister's light. And it wasn't just about looks or grades. It was about the way our mother carved out 2 separate roles for us. One of them shining, flawless, a daughter to be admired and paraded in front of family and neighbors, while the other one was flawed, always wrong, always reminded of her shortcomings, and that role was mine. I can still hear my mother's voice telling me that I had to try harder, that I should be more graceful, more ambitious, more like my sister, as if there was a mold I was supposed to fit into, and no matter how much I twisted and turned, I would never get in. And instead of love, I received a constant measuring stick pressed against my back, one that always declared me less. Childhood moments that should have been sweet memories were instead lessons in humiliation, like when I came home proud of a drawing I had done at school, only to hear my mother say it was messy, and then praise my sister's painting as if it belonged in a gallery, and I learned to swallow envy until it tasted like silence in my throat. I remember so clearly the night of my mother's 50th birthday, when the entire family gathered at a lavish restaurant and the spotlight was meant to shine only on her and my sister. And though I was there, I was not truly present in their eyes. She gestured me toward a chair at the very back, far from the head table where she and my sister sat basking in admiration. And as they raised glasses of champagne and clinked them together, I sipped water from my place in the shadows, pretending not to notice the dismissive glances and the little smirks from cousins who had learned from our mother that I was never the one worth celebrating. When the family photos came, my mother physically placed me at the far edge, so far that in half the pictures only part of my body made it into the frame. And though I smiled, inside I was breaking into pieces, because in that moment I understood that even in our own home I was never truly counted. Those photos were later displayed proudly on her living room wall, and when I saw myself half cut off, it felt symbolic, like she had always wanted me erased from the narrative of our family. And now, years later, the same pattern repeated itself at my sister's wedding, as if no time had passed at all. Only the stage had changed, but the play remained the same. I was seated at the furthest table, not with cousins or friends, but with distant relatives who barely remembered my name. Their polite smiles a cover for the awkwardness of being forced to sit with the forgotten ones, while the golden circle of guests closer to the bride laughed and sparkled under the lights. My son, who deserved at least a seat among the children, was denied a place at their table because the bride had declared that she wanted things to look neat and balanced, and she said it with a sharp edge that cut me deeper than she realized, because it wasn't about balance. It was about pushing us to the outskirts, about reminding me and everyone else that we were not equal. When I tried to speak up, my mother silenced me with a single glance, the kind that always carried years of power, the kind that told me I was unworthy of making demands. In that moment, I saw my little boy standing there holding his plate, looking lost, and my heart cracked with a familiar pain, because I realized he too was being dragged into this cruel legacy of being made to feel less. The whispers floated through the air like poisonous threads, weaving themselves around me until they wrapped tight against my skin, and though the words were not spoken loudly, they were sharp enough to cut. I heard them speculate that it was no wonder I was alone, that of course I had driven his father away, that a woman like me couldn't hold on to a man, and though they smiled behind their champagne glasses, they made sure the sound carried to my ears, like cruel gossip disguised as casual conversation. I sat there with a faint smile plastered on my face, holding my posture as if I were unbothered, but inside I was burning. My chest heavy with humiliation, my mind screaming for it to stop. The music, the laughter, the clinking of glasses all blended together into a storm of noise that drowned out my own voice. And I wondered how much more they expected me to endure before I shattered completely. I wanted to disappear, to become invisible, yet at the same time some stubborn part of me refused, clinging to the idea that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of my story, that one day the balance would tip and the cruelty I suffered would no longer be the only truth people saw. As the evening dragged on, the wedding became a theater of small cruelties dressed up as celebration, and I felt myself shrinking in my chair as my sister floated through the room like a queen surrounded by her court, her voice rising above the music as she told story after story designed to highlight her perfection and my supposed failures, each anecdote a needle sliding under my skin until I could barely hold my expression steady. She spoke of how she had always been the responsible one, how she had never let herself go, a thinly veiled jab at my body after childbirth, and people chuckled politely as if the humiliation of a family member was just another bit of wedding entertainment. My son sat quietly at my side now, his little hands clasping mine, sensing the tension even if he didn't fully understand it, and the weight of his trust made the sting of each insult deeper, because I knew he was learning from all of this what it meant to be treated as lesser. Every time I lifted my eyes toward the head table, I caught the glances of a few guests, some pitying, some amused, and my mother's face as she whispered into someone's ear with a look of satisfaction that made my stomach turn. My sister went further, announcing with a sugar-sweet smile that she was grateful for every wrong turn I had taken because it made her path look even brighter. And the laughter this time was louder, rolling across the room like a wave, breaking against me until I felt soaked in shame. I wanted to stand up to shout that I had a degree, that I had built a life with my own 2 hands, that I had sacrificed so much for the very people laughing at me. But my voice stayed trapped behind my teeth, swallowed like it always had been in this family, because somewhere deep inside I still believed that causing a scene would only prove them right. And yet something had shifted. Between the bursts of laughter and the clinking of glasses, I caught the look on the groom's face. Not the smile he had been wearing all night, but something harder, darker. A flicker of tension at the corner of his mouth that told me he was not enjoying this performance. He was gripping his glass too tightly, his knuckles pale, and when my sister leaned over to whisper something in his ear, he pulled slightly away, his eyes darting briefly toward me as though weighing something. It was the smallest thing, a crack in the mask of perfection, but it lodged in my mind and began to grow, a quiet whisper of possibility that maybe I was not the only one seeing the truth tonight. The air in the room felt heavier after that, the lights too bright, the laughter too forced, and I realized that while my humiliation was public, my sister's secret might be just as fragile, waiting for the right moment to shatter. I sat there, back straight, heart hammering, and for the first time that night, I didn't feel entirely powerless. I didn't know what would happen, but I could sense it building, an undercurrent moving beneath the surface of the celebration, carrying with it the hint of a storm. In that moment, holding my son's hand, staring at the groom's tense profile, I felt a strange, quiet anticipation rise inside me like a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The feeling that the story of this night was far from over and that maybe, just maybe, the balance was about to shift. As the night went on, the wedding felt less like a celebration and more like a stage play in which every character had been assigned a role they could not escape. And my role was clearly meant to be the fool, the one everyone laughed at so that the bride could shine brighter. Yet beneath the bright lights and the endless toasts, something began to shift. My sister's laughter grew louder, a little too sharp, as though she believed that if she mocked me enough, she could silence whatever doubts she was trying to smother inside herself. She clung to the microphone like a lifeline, spinning story after story at my expense, and while some guests still clapped, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging hesitant glances. Their unease wasn't about me, it was about her, about the overkill, about the desperation bleeding through her polished act. And when I looked at the groom, I saw the mask he had been wearing all evening start to slip, the tight smile no longer convincing, his eyes shadowed with something heavy, something he hadn't yet spoken but clearly carried with him. That look transported me back to a moment weeks earlier, a fleeting encounter that now made chilling sense. I had been walking home from work when I spotted them outside an expensive restaurant, my sister clinging to his arm with that same dazzling smile she always used to perform for an audience. But his smile hadn't matched hers. He looked stiff, distracted, as though every touch of hers was a reminder of something he wished he could forget. At the time, I dismissed it as nerves before the wedding, but now, sitting in that overheated reception hall, I replayed it in my mind with new clarity. It wasn't nerves, it was weariness, a man carrying a truth he couldn't share, and the pieces began to fall into place. And then, as if fate wanted to underline the thought, one of my cousins leaned across the table with a smirk and whispered that if the groom ever learned the whole story about my sister, this wedding would never have happened. The words hit me like a secret delivered on a silver tray, half in jest, half in warning, and I tucked them away as proof that the cracks I sensed were real. My sister, oblivious to the shifting air around her, lifted her glass high and aimed another toast squarely at me, her smile stretched wide and venomous. She thanked me mockingly for showing her what not to do with a life, her words wrapped in sweetness but dripping with cruelty. This time the laughter was not as strong, not as unanimous as before. Some people chuckled politely, but others looked down into their glasses, their smiles faltering, as though even they could feel the cruelty had crossed a line. I watched her standing there, radiant in her gown and jewelry, so certain of her superiority, so confident that humiliating me would secure her status as the perfect bride, and yet all I could think about was how fragile it all looked now, how a single gust of truth could topple her tower of pride. Our eyes met for a heartbeat across the room, and while she expected to see defeat in mine, what she saw instead was a small, controlled smile, because I had finally realized that her confidence was nothing more than a shaky performance, and behind the curtain there were secrets she desperately hoped would never come to light. The groom's silence grew heavier than any words could have been. His hand gripped his glass so tightly I thought it might shatter, and when my sister leaned down to whisper something into his ear, he pulled back just slightly, enough to be noticed by anyone paying close attention. His gaze drifted across the room, searching, restless, until it landed on me. And this time there was no mistaking it. His eyes weren't filled with pity or amusement like the others, but with a recognition that chilled me and comforted me at once. It was the look of someone who knew betrayal, someone who understood what it was like to be hurt by the very person who should have offered loyalty. That moment, brief as it was, lit something inside me that had been nearly extinguished all evening. It was not triumph, not yet, but it was hope, fragile and flickering, a reminder that the night was not over and the story was still being written. For the first time since I had stepped into that hall, I sat taller, my humiliation no longer crushing me into silence, because I could feel a storm building just beneath the surface, waiting for its moment to break. The hall buzzed with music and chatter, but beneath the glitter of chandeliers and the sweet scent of roses, I felt something bitter, curling at the edges of the night, an unease that grew heavier with every passing moment. My sister still held court with her circle of admirers, spinning stories where she played the heroine and I the cautionary tale, yet her laughter had a brittle ring to it now, like glass, ready to crack. The groom sat rigid beside her, his jaw tight, his smile thin, and when he rose to refill his glass, I saw the way his hand trembled just slightly, enough for me to notice, but perhaps not enough for the rest. I thought again of what my cousin had whispered, that if he knew the truth, there would be no wedding, and the words gnawed at me, stirring the memory I had tried to bury. The sight of my sister weeks earlier sliding into a car that wasn't his, leaning close to a man I didn't recognize, her hand brushing against his as if they shared a secret they didn't want the world to see. At the time I told myself it wasn't my place, that maybe I had misread it, that accusing her without proof would only brand me as bitter and jealous. I swallowed it like I always did, telling myself to protect the fragile peace of the family. But now, watching her bask in false glory, I realized it had been more than my imagination. The signs were everywhere once I chose to see them. The way she lingered on her phone at family dinners, the sudden trips she claimed were for the wedding preparations, the expensive gifts she wore that didn't match the groom's modest style. I remembered catching a glimpse of a necklace on her that I later saw in a boutique catalog marked at a price far beyond what the groom could afford, and I had wondered then, but pushed it aside. Now those small details came rushing back, weaving themselves into a story far darker than the fairy tale she wanted everyone to believe. Around me, the whispers had changed too, subtle but sharper now, not all of them aimed at me. I heard one aunt murmur to another that she had spotted my sister leaving a hotel downtown months ago, far from the bridal shops she claimed to visit. A pair of cousins exchanged sly looks, hinting that the bride's halo wasn't as spotless as she pretended. Even as the band played louder and waiters carried trays of champagne, I could sense it. The shift in the air, the tension coiling tighter, the fragile veneer of perfection beginning to thin. My humiliation still lingered like an open wound, but beneath it there was a pulse of anticipation, because for the first time I wasn't the only subject of whispers. They were circling her now, too, faint at first, but growing. The groom returned to his seat, his eyes darker than before, his lips pressed into a line. And when my sister tried to loop her arm through his, he didn't flinch, but he didn't lean closer either. Their smiles looked staged, their touches rehearsed, and anyone watching closely could see the disconnect. I kept my gaze steady, heart racing, and for once I didn't feel powerless. There was a plan unfolding, not mine exactly, but something larger, inevitable, as though the truth itself had grown tired of being buried and was clawing its way to the surface. I didn't know when the eruption would come, but I could feel it building with every toast, every forced laugh, every brittle smile, and I sat there bracing for the moment when the storm would finally break. The longer the night stretched, the more desperate my sister seemed to hold on to her performance, as though, if she kept talking loudly enough and shining brightly enough, no one would notice the shadows crawling up behind her. She raised yet another toast, thanking the guests for celebrating her perfect union, her words syrupy sweet but her eyes restless, darting too quickly between the faces in the room. She made another joke at my expense, something about how not everyone can keep a man, and a few guests gave forced chuckles, but the laughter was thinner now, more uncomfortable than amused. I could feel the shift like a subtle tremor beneath the floor, the kind that tells you the ground isn't stable anymore, and even though she was still standing tall in her sparkling gown, I could see the cracks spreading. The groom sat stiff, his silence screaming louder than any speech could have, and every time she reached for him, his body leaned just slightly away, a gesture so small, most missed it, but not me. His eyes no longer scanned the crowd with pride. Instead, they were dark, stormy, locked somewhere far away, as though he was rehearsing words in his mind, words too heavy to say but impossible to keep inside much longer. Once or twice his gaze flicked toward me again, steady and almost searching, and in that moment I understood. He wasn't just tired, he was angry, carrying the weight of truths that could crush her perfect facade in an instant. And though my humiliation still burned fresh in my chest, a strange calm settled over me, because I knew that if anyone was going to change the direction of this night, it wasn't going to be me, it was going to be him. My sister, blind to the shifting energy, carried on like a performer too addicted to the spotlight to see the audience losing interest. She teased me again, this time dragging my son into it, saying that he looked just like the man who ran away. A cruel jab that froze my blood, and I wanted to leap up and shield him from her venom. But before I could move, I noticed the groom's hand slam down against the table, not loudly enough to echo across the hall, but hard enough that the glasses rattled and heads turned. She laughed nervously, brushing it off as though he were just overexcited. But I saw the fury flicker across his face, a storm he was barely containing. It was the first visible crack in their staged perfection, and the room felt it, a ripple of unease passing through the guests. The music carried on, the servers passed plates, but all of it felt hollow now, just noise masking the silence that hummed beneath the surface. My humiliation had been public, but I could sense hers creeping closer, waiting for its moment to burst into the open. The air was heavy, charged like the moment before a thunderstorm when you can feel electricity tingling against your skin. I sat straighter, my son's small hand warm in mine, and I thought to myself that for years I had carried the burden of being the one looked down on, the one cut out of the picture. But tonight might not end with me being the family's shame. Tonight, for once, the truth was gathering itself like a wave, ready to crash. And when it did, it would sweep her carefully built world away in front of the very people she had sought to impress. The band had just finished their upbeat number, and the last notes of the saxophone still lingered in the air when the groom suddenly scraped his chair back from the head table. The sound, sharp and metallic against the polished floor, sliced through the clinking of glasses and bursts of laughter like a knife, and the effect was instant. Every conversation stuttered to a halt, forks froze halfway to plates, and dozens of eyes swiveled toward him in unison. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate, his suit jacket pulled tight across his shoulders, as though he had been carrying the weight of this moment for hours. His hand reached for the microphone with a steady finality, and though the guests were expecting another charming toast, something in the air told me this was different. My sister, radiant in her gown, clapped lightly and tilted her head toward him with an indulgent smile, certain he was about to shower her with devotion. She had no idea that the same stage she had used to mock me was about to turn into her own undoing. He stood there with the microphone resting just below his lips, scanning the hall with eyes that were calm on the surface, but heavy with restrained fury, and the silence that followed stretched so long it became a living thing of its own. The guests leaned forward in anticipation, some already raising their glasses in eager readiness, but their smiles began to falter when no words came. My mother, her lipstick fresh and her posture proud, leaned toward my sister and whispered something, probably encouragement to bask in the attention. But the sight only sharpened the unease because the groom's expression wasn't soft or tender. It was stone. His gaze swept across the room slowly, pausing on clusters of relatives, slipping past the friends who had come to celebrate, and then it landed on me. The moment his eyes locked with mine, I felt the air thicken in my chest because it wasn't a fleeting glance. It was deliberate, filled with meaning, as if he wanted me to know that what was about to happen was not only for himself, but somehow also for me. My sister, sensing the pause was stretching too far, tried to fill it with a giggle, her high-pitched laugh bouncing awkwardly against the silence. She raised her glass and encouraged everyone to do the same, chirping about how her husband had the most beautiful words prepared. But he didn't raise his. Instead, he tightened his grip on the stem of the microphone, his knuckles blanching white, and the sound of his breathing hummed faintly through the speakers. The hall shifted uneasily. People straightened in their chairs. A few exchanged puzzled glances. And the band members, caught off guard, set their instruments down slowly, as though they too felt the storm approaching. Then finally, his voice broke the silence, calm but sharp, steady but weighted with emotion. "I've waited too long to say this," he began, and the words fell like stones in water, sending ripples of tension across the room. Guests leaned in further, expecting perhaps a poetic preamble to a vow, but there was no softness in his tone, only steel and something dangerously close to anger. My sister's smile twitched at the corners, and her hand clutched at his sleeve with an almost imperceptible shake. I sat motionless, my body taut like a string drawn tight, my son's small hand anchoring me to my chair, his eyes wide and unblinking, as though even he could sense the shift in the air. The hall no longer felt like a wedding. It felt like the moment before a trial when everyone waits for the verdict. Each second stretched until it quivers. The chandeliers above seemed to burn hotter, the air heavy with expectation, and I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears in time with the silence that pressed in from all sides. Every humiliation of the evening still lingered in me, but now it was receding, overshadowed by a different pulse. The knowledge that for the first time, the spotlight wasn't on me. It had swung to him, and with just one cryptic sentence, he had seized every gaze in the room, pulling the rug from under her flawless performance. Everyone was leaning forward, holding their breath, balanced on the edge of something enormous, and though no one yet knew what he was about to say, I understood one thing with certainty. My sister's perfect facade was seconds away from crumbling, and when it did, there would be no way back. The silence in the hall grew unbearable, stretching tighter and tighter until it snapped with his next words, heavy and deliberate, cutting through the air like glass shattering on marble. He didn't smile, he didn't soften his tone. He simply looked out at the crowd and said that he had been living inside a lie, a carefully staged illusion crafted not for love, but for appearances. The room gasped in unison, and I felt the collective shock ripple through the guests like a physical wave, shoulders stiffening, hands lowering glasses mid-air. My sister's laughter sputtered and died, her smile freezing into something brittle. Her hand clamped tighter on his arm as though she could hold him in place with sheer force. But he stepped slightly away, shaking her grip loose, and for the first time in the night, she looked genuinely unsettled. He went on, his voice steady but filled with restrained fury, telling the guests that while they toasted to eternal devotion, he had been receiving evidence that painted a very different picture. Murmurs spread like wildfire across the tables. guests leaning toward one another with wide eyes, and the band members sat frozen with their instruments in hand, staring at the stage as though they were watching a train derail in real time. My mother's face, once glowing with smug superiority, drained of color as the weight of his words sank in. And then he delivered the first undeniable blow. He said my sister had not only been unfaithful, but had carried on multiple affairs, slipping out of their shared home with lies about bridal fittings, meeting other men in hotels and restaurants while he worked late into the night, building a life for her. The gasp that followed was louder, sharper, a collective intake of breath that made the chandeliers seem to tremble. My sister tried to interrupt, her voice rising high, insisting that he was mistaken, that people were jealous and had twisted stories, but he didn't let her finish. He pulled his phone from his pocket, raising it high for everyone to see, and with a flick of his thumb he scrolled through messages that glowed across the screen. Even from my distant table, I could see the explicit words, the intimate photos, evidence that silenced any doubt. A woman at the next table covered her mouth with both hands. Another muttered that she had suspected something all along, and the whispers swelled into a roar of disbelief. My sister's face flushed deep crimson, her carefully applied makeup unable to mask the truth bleeding out of every pixel. She reached for the phone, but he turned away, his voice now louder, declaring that he would not spend another day shackled to someone who treated trust like a joke. The hall was no longer a wedding celebration. It had transformed into a public tribunal, and the bride who had mocked me mercilessly an hour earlier now stood exposed in the harshest light imaginable. Guests who had laughed at her jokes were whispering behind their hands, their expressions a mix of shock and contempt. My humiliation still ached, but it was quickly overtaken by something new, something sharp and intoxicating. Vindication. I sat still, my heart racing, but for once the burning heat of shame wasn't mine. It was hers, radiating outward as her perfect world cracked and splintered under the weight of his words. And as he lowered the phone, his final sentence of that moment was clear and unforgiving. He had walked into this hall with a fiancée, but he would not be walking out with a wife. The moment his words settled over the hall, the atmosphere shifted from celebration to chaos, the chatter rising into a low roar as whispers zipped from table to table, each guest scrambling to repeat what they had just heard, as if confirming it to themselves. My sister's perfect image began to disintegrate before my eyes, the smile that had been glued to her lips twisting into something jagged and panicked. She clutched at his sleeve, begging him to stop, insisting with a voice that cracked under pressure that he was humiliating her unfairly, that this was a mistake, that someone must have fabricated the evidence. The same mouth that had so confidently mocked me now stammered and faltered, unable to string together a convincing sentence. The confidence she had wielded like a weapon just an hour ago had drained from her body, leaving her exposed and trembling, and the guests who had laughed at her jokes now sat in stunned silence, their eyes wide, their expressions darkened by disbelief. She turned desperately to my mother, her eyes pleading, her fingers reaching for the only ally she thought she had left. But my mother's face was no longer radiant with pride. Instead, she looked pale, unsettled. Her lips pressed together so tightly they seemed to vanish, her eyes darting nervously from the glowing phone in the groom's hand to the horrified faces circling the tables. For the first time, my mother had no clever defense ready, no scathing remark to shield her golden child, and the silence between them spoke louder than words. My sister tried another tactic, her voice pitched higher as she pointed toward me, claiming that I must have stirred this up, that jealous tongues had poisoned her fiancé's mind, but her words clattered to the ground, ignored and dismissed, because the evidence glared back from the screen, undeniable and merciless. The laughter that once filled the room had been replaced by gasps, murmurs, and sharp whispers, and the collective judgment of the guests was palpable, pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't bear. And then came the shift that made my chest tighten with something I hadn't felt in years. The guests' eyes, once aimed at me with pity or mockery, began to change. They lingered on me longer now, studying the way I sat still with my son's small hand in mine, my back straight, my expression calm despite the storm swirling around me. What they saw was not weakness or shame. It was endurance, dignity, quiet strength in the face of cruelty. The same cousins who had smirked at me earlier now looked away, their faces tinged with guilt, unwilling to meet my eyes. Aunts and uncles whispered not about my failures, but about her downfall, shaking their heads at how far she had fallen, their words laced with contempt for the very woman they once praised. And somewhere in the crowd, a woman I barely knew gave me the smallest nod, an acknowledgement that though I had been the target, I was the one who had emerged untouched by the fire, while my sister was burning alive in it. My sister's voice grew thinner with every attempt to salvage her image, her words tumbling over themselves as she begged first him, then the guests, to believe her, to understand that things weren't what they seemed. She reached for tears, hoping sympathy might soften the blow, but the sight of her mascara running down her cheeks only hardened the room against her. What once might have been seen as fragility now appeared as desperation, the last defense of someone who had been unmasked too thoroughly to escape. The groom stood unmoved, his face carved with resolve, and in that stark contrast, his cold steadiness against her unraveling pleas, the truth became undeniable. She was no longer the flawless bride basking in her own superiority. She was a fraud, and I, the woman she had mocked as unwanted and discarded, was the only one left sitting tall. The contrast was so sharp it almost stole my breath. From ridicule to respect, from shame to dignity, the balance had shifted in a single night, and for the first time I felt the weight of years of humiliation sliding off my shoulders, replaced by something powerful and liberating. The wedding hall that had been designed to dazzle with crystal chandeliers, flowing champagne, and endless laughter now buzzed with a very different sound, a restless hum that carried judgment sharper than any insult could have. Guests who had once circled my sister like moths around a flame now shrank back from her glow, realizing it was nothing but smoke and mirrors. Their voices rose in pockets across the room, not in celebration but in disbelief, as if each person was desperate to confirm with their neighbor that they had truly witnessed the bride stripped bare. Women who had smiled smugly beside her earlier now exchanged cutting remarks, shaking their heads and muttering words like shameless liar and disgrace, while men who had toasted to her grace just an hour before now looked away, embarrassed to have ever admired her. Even the children sensed the collapse. Their dancing stilled, their eyes wide as they clutched their parents' hands, staring at the bride who had transformed from a fairy tale figure into a cautionary tale before their very eyes. My mother, who for years had been her fiercest defender and my harshest critic, sat rigid at the head table like a porcelain figure, beginning to crack. The pride she had worn so easily when my sister mocked me earlier was gone, replaced by a hollow stiffness, as if she could not comprehend the sight of her golden child sinking into disgrace. Her lips were pressed together so tightly they had turned white, her eyes darting around the hall in frantic little movements, searching for anyone willing to look back at her with approval. But the room had shifted, the current no longer flowing in her favor, and she seemed smaller somehow, stripped of the power she once wielded so effortlessly. Twice her gaze flicked toward me, sharp and uncertain, and for the first time in my life, I saw hesitation there, even fear, as though she had suddenly realized that the daughter she had dismissed for so long was the one who had endured and survived. Yet I gave her nothing, no nod, no glance of sympathy, because I knew she had earned this silence every bit as much as my sister had earned her public fall. All around me, the atmosphere throbbed with judgment, and yet none of it touched me. The humiliation that had once burned in my chest had drained away, leaving behind a strange lightness, as if I had finally set down a burden I had carried for years. The people who had mocked me quietly or laughed along with her cruelty were now forced to see me differently, their eyes lingering on me with expressions that ranged from regret to quiet respect. Cousins who had turned their backs on me at family gatherings now looked down at their plates, unable to meet my gaze, while aunts who had once whispered about my mistakes now shook their heads at her downfall, whispering that perhaps they had judged me too harshly. There were even nods of acknowledgement from those who had ignored me completely before. Small gestures, but powerful enough to make my throat tighten with a kind of vindication I had never thought I would feel. They saw me now, not as a failure, not as an embarrassment, but as the one who had borne years of cruelty with dignity. I sat taller in my chair, my son's small hand warm against my palm, and I felt a calm strength I hadn't known in years. The same room that had once echoed with cruel laughter at my expense was now filled with whispers condemning her. The same people who had looked down on me now shifting their gaze with shame. I hadn't spoken a word, yet the truth had reshaped everything around me. My sister, once untouchable, was unraveling in front of them all, and my mother, once untouchable herself, was silent, powerless to stop it. For the first time in my life, I was not invisible. I was not dismissed. I was not the object of pity or ridicule. I was the quiet figure who had endured long enough to see the tide turn. The respect I felt in those fleeting glances was more intoxicating than any revenge I could have plotted, because it was not forced, it was not asked for, it was earned. And as I squeezed my son's hand, I understood that the scales had finally tipped, and that weight, that balance, would never go back the way it had been before. The noise of whispers still filled the air when the groom pushed his chair back one final time, his movements sharp and decisive, as though every step had been rehearsed in his mind long before this moment. With steady hands, he reached for his ring, sliding it off with a clarity of purpose that made the entire hall freeze. The small band of gold caught the light of the chandeliers as he held it between his fingers, his expression carved with a coldness that left no room for doubt. His voice carried across the hall, firm and unshaken, declaring that he would not chain himself to someone who treated loyalty as if it were disposable and love as if it were a stage play. Then he dropped the ring onto the linen-draped table with a sharp metallic clink that reverberated through the silence, louder and more final than any music played that night. Gasps broke out around the room. My sister stumbled forward with a strangled cry, clutching at his arm as if she could stop the collapse with sheer desperation. But he shook her off with a single sharp movement. Straightening his jacket, he looked around once more, his gaze sweeping over the crowd like a man laying down a verdict. And then he walked away, leaving her frozen under the burning weight of every eye in the room. The impact of his departure rippled instantly through the hall. Conversations resumed in broken fragments, but they were no longer celebratory. They were sharp, cutting, filled with disbelief and condemnation. Some guests stood abruptly, pushing chairs back in a rush to leave, whispering that they had suspected something all along, that the bride had always been too good to be true. Others lingered, their faces twisted in fascination, as though they couldn't look away from the wreckage of a spectacle unraveling before them. Plates of cake went untouched, champagne flutes sweated on tables abandoned in haste, and the careful choreography of a night meant to sparkle dissolved into chaos. The band, uncertain, set their instruments down quietly, their eyes darting nervously at one another, unwilling to play over the storm that had replaced music with humiliation. Even the children had grown silent, tugging at their parents' hands to leave, sensing instinctively that joy had been replaced by something heavy and bitter, something they did not fully understand but felt all the same. The grand hall, once glowing with warmth, now felt suffocating, like a stage after the curtain had fallen on a tragedy. At the head table, my mother sat frozen, her posture stiff, but her composure fractured. Her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned pale, her eyes fixed not on her daughter but on the floor, as though she could will herself invisible. For the first time in my life, she looked lost, stripped of her usual command, unable to summon a single phrase to protect the daughter she'd always held above all else. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a hard, bloodless line, her eyes darting in frantic flickers as if searching for someone to affirm that this nightmare wasn't real. But affirmation never came. The guest's judgment was too loud, too final, and she could not stop the tide. Twice she looked at me, her eyes narrowing with something that was not quite anger but not yet apology, a desperate search for footing that she would never find. Watching her sit in silence, stripped of her weapons, was a moment almost as powerful as the groom's declaration, because it was the collapse not only of my sister's crown, but also of my mother's unwavering arrogance. My sister, the bride who had danced so proudly at the center of her own spectacle, now stood like a broken doll under the merciless light of the chandeliers. Her gown, once flawless, was wrinkled and stained from her own clutching hands. Her makeup streaked down her cheeks in dark lines that only amplified the grotesque contrast to the image she had tried to project. She spun slowly, her eyes darting desperately across the room, searching for someone, anyone, who would defend her. But all she met were turned backs, lowered eyes, and sharp whispers filled with scorn. Even her closest friends edged toward the exits, unwilling to be tethered to her disgrace. The applause that had thundered when she walked into the hall was gone, replaced by the shuffle of feet and the hollow echo of retreating voices. In her gaze there was terror, not just of being abandoned, but of finally being seen for what she was. And in that moment I realized the true weight of her punishment. She had stripped me bare in front of this family, mocked me for years, reduced me to silence, but tonight it was she who stood exposed, utterly alone, and there would be no recovering from it. When the last of the guests had drifted out and the great doors of the wedding hall closed with a dull echo, I stepped outside into the cool night air, the sudden silence wrapping around me like a blanket after hours of suffocating noise. The sky stretched dark and endless above me, dotted with stars that seemed brighter now than they had just a few hours before, as though even the heavens wanted to remind me that there was still light after darkness. My son's small hand clutched mine tightly, his eyes filled with confusion and weariness, and I bent down to meet his gaze, brushing the hair from his forehead. I whispered softly that we were going home, that we were safe, that everything was going to be all right, and for the first time in so many years, I felt the truth of those words settle deep in my chest. The humiliation of the evening had burned away, leaving behind a strange, steady calm. I was no longer carrying the shame that had been piled on me for years. I was carrying proof that dignity survives even when the world tries to crush it. Before stepping fully away, I turned my head and glanced back through the tall windows of the hall, and the sight etched itself into my memory. My sister still stood in the middle of the room, her once gleaming gown wrinkled and dirty where she had gripped it with trembling fists, her hair in disarray, streaks of black mascara running down her cheeks like ink stains. She no longer looked like the perfect bride everyone had come to celebrate. She looked like a frightened child, lost and abandoned, with no one left to hold her up. The crowd that had adored her had vanished. Her friends had slipped away. Even my mother sat apart from her, stiff and silent, too broken by her own pride to reach out. My sister's eyes darted wildly from face to face, but all she met were turned backs and empty chairs. The woman who had spent her life feeding on applause and admiration now stood stripped of both, and the emptiness around her was more brutal than any insult she had hurled at me. I should have pitied her, but I didn't. because she had written this ending herself. Later that night, when I finally reached the quiet safety of our small apartment, I tucked my son into bed and watched him curl beneath his blanket, his breathing evening out as he slipped into dreams. I sat alone in the dim light of our living room, the hum of the city faint in the distance, and let myself reflect on everything that had unfolded. My life had never been simple. It was still hard, still heavy at times, still filled with struggles that I carried mostly on my own. But it was mine, honest and unpolished. And unlike my sister, I didn't need to craft lies or build illusions to make it worth living. I thought about the looks I had seen in the eyes of our relatives, the shift from judgment to recognition, from disdain to quiet respect. For the first time, they had seen me not as a mistake or a shadow, but as a woman who had endured, who had survived cruelty without losing her humanity. That respect, unspoken but undeniable, felt more precious than any apology could have, because it was real and it could never be erased. And in the stillness of that night, I understood the moral as clearly as if it had been whispered into my ear. You cannot build happiness by destroying others, because eventually the lies crumble and the cruelty turns back on the one who wields it. My sister had mocked me, belittled me, used me as her contrast to shine brighter, but in the end it was those very choices that left her standing alone in ruins. I didn't need to fight her. I didn't need to plot revenge. All I needed was to endure long enough for the truth to come to light. And it did, louder and clearer than I could have imagined. As I turned off the light and settled into bed, I felt a quiet strength take root inside me, the kind that doesn't shout or demand attention, but simply exists, steady and unshakable. I had my son. I had my dignity. And I had the certainty that life has a way of balancing the scales. Karma always finds its way home, and that night, it found hers. Sharing this story wasn't easy for me, but I believe every woman who has ever been laughed at or pushed aside deserves to feel that justice can come in its own time. If this story touched you, if it made you angry, or if it gave you that feeling of relief when the truth finally wins, please take a moment to leave a comment and tell me what you felt. Your thoughts mean so much more than you think. They remind me I'm not alone. And if you can, hit that like button and subscribe, because your support is what helps me keep telling these stories. Stories that matter, stories that show we are stronger than people give us credit for.